Well, first of all, thanks so much for being here today. So today, I'm going to be completely honest to you guys. I love animations, and in fact, just for the sake of this presentation, I created this very animation here. So let's initialize it. Ooh. All right. So let's get started. My name is Adrian, and today I'd like to talk to you about three things. I'd like to talk about why animations is such a big thing today, and how we can think about animations, how we can improve the way we create animations. And then finally, I'd like to shortly talk about how we can share and communicate animations to our teams or to our clients, and how, like, finding the right vocabulary. So I have 99 slides, so we better get started, right? Let me just quickly see if that thing here works. That seems to work. So when we talk about animations, we're actually mostly talking about interaction. And the more I thought about this, the more I wondered, why do people care about animations in the first place? And that brought up another question. So most people would tell me that the reason they create animations in their interfaces is because they want to create delightful experiences. But what makes an experience actually delightful? Is it when it's effortless, like loading new tweets on Twitter? Or is it when it's seamless, when data is automatically loaded? Well, I think it's when people experience flow, when they become involved in an experience as a whole. Because if you think about it, the other two factors that I've just mentioned, they just contribute to flow. If you're in Twitter and loading new tweets, it keeps you in the flow of reading tweets, so that's a good thing, obviously, right? So a lot of research has been done on the concept of flow, and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, a big man with a big name, he defined flow as the holistic experience that people feel when they act with total involvement. Now, when I read his book, I also found that people who experience flow, they actually get a sense of clarity, a sense of ecstasy, and they actually find this experience to be highly rewarding. It even goes so far that they will pay for this experience. And the more I thought about this, the more I realized that's pretty much how I want people to feel, people who use my products. So unfortunately, not all animations contribute to flow. Let's look at this example from the realm of the web. I was trying to find some plugins for my Sublime text editor to improve my workflow. And as I was looking forward to discover great content, what I saw was this. Now, I call them social media buttons on crack. You can call them whatever you want, but we probably all agree that that's some bullshit right there, right? And the evil thing about this is that we're genetically programmed to look at things that move. So we can't help ourselves but to stare at these weird social media buttons, right? Like we haven't seen enough of them. And then we have The Verge. This is actually a great article. Now, it's just a little hard to read this article, because once you scroll down to this, once you start scrolling, you see this kind of iOS notifications showing up all the way through. It's this really cool experience, right? And the problem with it is really that once you've seen it, it doesn't really build up any anticipation anymore, because you already know what's happening. So it's not surprising anymore, it's not delightful, but it does a great job in distracting the reader. So, and then we have the guys who tell us that we should use the 12 Walt Disney animation principles and apply it to UI design. And in the interface that initially looks like this, right, let me play that again, looks really serious, suddenly looks like this. So, imagine typing your credit card data in a window like that. It's not exactly trustworthy. It reminds you of an interface made out of soap, and when you click on that button, probably bubbles are going to show up or something. So I'm not saying we shouldn't try to build better interfaces or interfaces that feel more natural, but we need to exercise some sort of restraint, because if you go too far, it quickly becomes very silly. So Um, Aiming for delight is not enough. And I think it's about creating smart interaction, and that's what actually creates delight in the first place. Now, I think in order to build better animations, we need to start thinking in spatial terms. Now, when we navigate websites or apps, we are often taken from one context to another, from one place to the next. But during this whole journey of navigation, we rarely consciously think about how these different pieces of information are actually related to each other in terms of spatiotemporal terms. And when we design digital experiences, it's alluring to think that we're liberated from the limitations that the real world imposes on us, but it turns out nothing could be farther from the truth. So, George Miller, one of the fathers of cognitive psychology, already observed in 1968 that we perceive our surroundings in spatial terms, whether it's digital or analog. So when we navigate places or cities, we build mental models just like when we navigate on screens. And Tyler Tate derived, based a model on this theory that I think is extremely valuable to create better experiences. And it starts with districts. Now, when we visit cities, we automatically subdivide it into smaller, manageable pieces. If you go to New York, for instance, you can't imagine New York as a whole. It's just overwhelming, right? But you can definitely imagine districts of it. And the same happens on digital spaces. If you go to the New York Times, they're doing exactly the same. They have sports, they have finance, they have lifestyle whatsoever. It helps us to get this data somehow together and map similar data. And then we have layers. Now, layers add another dimension to information spaces, namely depth. So just like when we're visiting a building, we know that we're quite there, but maybe not there yet, right? So if you imagine going to an IMDb.com, for instance, and you're looking for action movies, then you know you're in the right resort, you're in the action movies resort, but maybe you just want to see movies that are newer than 2001. So then what you do is you give a user fine-grained control on his content, and that's what layers are all about, different layers of information that allow you to have more fine-grained control on content. And then finally we have nodes. Now, nodes represent endpoints like detail pages or article pages on a newspaper, and if we combine these things all together to one, we get what I call a spatial representation, or you can also call it a spatial environment. Now, is there any possibility that I can get a bottle of water? Sorry. I didn't see it. Perfect, it's hidden here. Okay, yeah, sorry. Okay, doing a mess here. All right. Now, let me show you a very basic example that just shows how important this actually is. Now, I think the best example to show it is when you hook up your Mac to an external device, to an external screen. Now, it's really easy to misconfigure your Mac and to configure the device to be on the left, even though it's physically on the right. And what happens is that you just use your mouse cursor, you hover on the edges of the screen, and then you suddenly find it popping up on the other side of the other screen, and it's completely irritating, right? And that just shows how deeply ingrained our perception, our spatial perception of our environment really is. Or let's look at another example. When you look at the iPhone screen, you see one screen filled with apps. But what's happening in our mind is actually different, right? Because if you perceive these apps, your mind automatically fills the gaps, and it knows, because you've used it, that it's screens, that there are different contiguous screens lined up to next to each one that allows you to get a better understanding of how these apps work and how this screen is distributed. And now, I don't know how many of you have an iPhone, but what's really interesting about the iPhone is that when you're on the home screen and you swipe through the home screen, you can see that there is no, I can't go any further. Now, from a digital perspective, we all know that we could easily restart again, huh? We could just go back there. But Apple didn't do that. Why didn't Apple do this? because this is not how reality works. Something in reality doesn't just work this way without you making a conscious effort to go back. It reinforces the way reality works and gives us a better understanding about how to interact with this device. And Apple took the concept of spaces to the extreme when they introduced mission control. Now, multi-desktop was a feature that was mostly reserved to power users. But ever since Apple introduced these different information spaces in such a highly visual way, it made using multi-desktop a much easier to use feature, right? Because when it's so visual, we can just click on it and we know where we are. It gives us orientation. But it's not always easy to get it right. So take this as an example. This is WriteApp. It's one of the many imitations of IA Writer, a distraction-free writing environment for iPhone, tablets, and Mac. And once you start writing, it's pretty straightforward. So you can write, cool, and you can click on that mobile button. Okay, you have a sidebar there. Okay, well, let's see again. We have 2 mobile buttons, and we have a side panel, and we have a settings panel, and we have 2 other panels that I didn't even record. So as you can see, this kind of spatial perception can quickly become a very irritating thing if we mess it up, because suddenly everything is on the same place and somehow they just fade in and we don't know what's happening. So I came up with 6 criteria that I believe allows us to create better animations, both functional and delightful. And it starts with the most crucial ingredient of all, and that's orientation. Now, orientation is one of the main reasons you want to use animation in UI design. Motion can guide users through an experience. Let's have a look at this very basic example. Now, imagine this is a simple 1-page document. And if you click on contact now, let's imagine you click on contact. That was abrupt. Now, we can't really tell what just happened. We just know that something changed on the screen. Now, in interaction design, moving from one information space to another takes a certain amount of time. And we can use time in interaction design to build motion. We can represent it with motion. So let's have a look at the same example again, but this time animated. So you click on contact, and this time it scrolls. Now this gives you a spatial orientation. You know that you're missing out content, and if you're seeing how you miss out this content, it's a conscious decision, because you can still go back. You see what you're missing out. And this is a real-world example from a WordPress theme, one of the best-selling WordPress themes called Ryu. And unfortunately, the image is cut down. But imagine there, you see that little black border on the top. There's actually a hamburger menu there. Of course, there's a hamburger menu, right? So if you go there and click on this hamburger icon, what happens is this, boom. We have no idea what just happened. Are we on a new page? Is this a kind of a pop-up or model? Are we in the footer? We don't really know. Now I slightly modified this theme and changed the JavaScript. And let me show you the same again. Now you go there, you click. Now it becomes really obvious. You just have to scroll down, and then you're back and you can close the menu again. Makes it very obvious. So sometimes we think that these are just details, but it's really, as Giles said, the small interactions can make a huge difference. In fact, it's often these tiny details that give us orientation in how to use apps in the first place. Let me give you another example how details can add up. For instance, in this basic example, we have this add item command, and once we click it, we can see that the plus rotates and becomes a cross. And the way, the direction in which it flows also reinforces the flow of information, the way information flows on the screen. Or we have context-aware labels. When you scroll, it's just a tiny modification on the screen, but it allows us to always provide context to the content you're currently looking at. And I loved Google's examples here. So when we use transitions, we have to make sure that we guide the user's attention. And what they said is really brilliant. You just draw a line. You imagine drawing a line for everything you animate on the screen, and as long as these lines do not overlap, you pretty much have a good idea that you're not making a mess. Because as soon as they're overlapping, you're making a mess, probably. So let's talk about responsiveness. Now, when you're working on the web, responsive design is mostly a term that is mostly understood as creating device-agnostic websites that adapt to different contexts. But in terms of user interface design, building a responsive interface means building an interface that responds to the user at all times. Now, let me show you one great example that I love, and it's called Performing Actions Optimistically by Mike Krieger from Instagram. And what he said, well, what is it all about? If you're sending a tweet on Twitter or liking a photo on Instagram, you can see what's happening here. It happens immediately. I send it, bam, it's there. So it happens immediately. Now, what does this even mean when we say it happens immediately? Nothing happens immediately, right? But what happens is that the user interface plays the animation even though the message has technically not arrived at the server yet. So this gives us some extra time we can use, and it keeps the user in the flow of the app and doesn't interrupt him. So as long as there is no error happening in the user interface, there's no reason to interrupt the user, which keeps him in the flow and is a great, delightful experience. And then we have seamless top-of-mind actions. When we think about chairs, we think about sitting. And we can use this knowledge to come up with better interactions in different user scenarios. So in the case of Twitter that we saw before, the primary intent that you have when you scroll up is to read new tweets. Whether you already have the latest tweets or not, it makes sense because it's just a natural gesture that you learn. So when you scroll up, it totally makes sense to have this pull to refresh interaction there, which was incredibly delightful. I still remember the first time I saw it. It was August 20, no, okay. You get the idea. Or then we have the fake reveal pattern as an example. As long as you're scrolling down, the user is in read mode, basically. His basic instinct, the thing he wants to do is reading. But as soon as he scrolls up, the user interface reappears. Now, these are just slight little details, but in a world where screen sizes are so limited, it makes a lot of sense to hide user interface when you don't need it. And then we have smart progressive disclosure. Now, progressive disclosure is just a fancy term to describe user interface elements that are hidden as long as you don't need them. And once the user has stated his primary intent to interact with it, you show more content based on this interaction. Now, one of the examples I really love is one of my colleague, Matt Smith, and he created what he calls the float label pattern. Now, the problem of forms that rely on placeholder text is that once you start filling in stuff, you basically overwrite the placeholder. So how can you make sure that you didn't just accidentally input your first name to the last name once you're finished filling out? Because you take your own inputs as a validation to see whether you did a good job. And the float label pattern tries to solve this problem because as soon as you start typing, the labels appear on top of the input. So you always get some sense of orientation, and once you've filled out the form, you can validate your inputs. You have an overview. And then we have this example, and this is pure genius. This is my most loved interaction design I've ever seen. So if you know this guy who did this, send me an email, please. So what happens here, this is WhatsApp. And if you want to send a voice message in WhatsApp, what you have to do, obviously, is to press that voice button over there. Let's see what happens. So he clicks that voice button. Now we have this slide to cancel animation. It's very subtle. And then you cancel. It's amazing. It's fantastic. You know, and the animation we just saw is not just an animation. It's really something, it's an animation that tells us a story. It tells us the story about how this product works. And in the case of WhatsApp, it's the tale of sending a voice message, right? So, then we have time. Now, animation and movement is also about time. And ironically, we perceive animation to be something spatial as well. When you talk about time, we pretty much say things like, that's in front of me, or that's behind me, I've left this behind me. So somehow Monday is here, and Tuesday is here. And when you think about it, distant events, a distant object tends to look blurred. Just like distant events, if you have events that are long in the past, they become blurred, just like distant objects. So that struck me and found it's really interesting. So it turns out we perceive time in different ways. 100 milliseconds feels like something is reacting instantly. 1 second means the user is aware of the delay, but it doesn't stop him from being in the flow. And then we have this 10 seconds limit, and once you go above this threshold, people will start doing other things. They'll call their relatives, they go to the kitchen, whatever. So you don't want to be there. And we can optimize experiences by keeping in mind what our friend Einstein once said. And he said, time is relative. Now, that was a very wise thing to say, right? And I loved this quote when he said that an hour sitting with a pretty girl on a park bench passes like a minute, but a minute sitting on a hot stove seems like an hour. So when we're jumping out of a plane, it feels like it takes forever. When we watch our clock tick, you can literally feel how time suddenly slows down. If you have seen Back to the Future, you know what I'm talking about. So what's the takeaway here? Perception changes our reality. We saw the Twitter example before. Showing an animation as feedback to the user's input makes the experience feel more responsive. When you go to Manhattan, 90% of the cross signal buttons do absolutely nothing. Now, why would anyone do that? Because it feels good. It feels good to be in control. It feels good to get a sense of control. And ironically, engaging and pressing buttons all the time cuts down perceived waiting time. So in UI design, we can change the subjective perception of time as well. Take progress bars as an example. Now, frequency variations are known to affect people's experience of time, people's perception of time. When progress bars are animated in subtle ways, we perceive them to be faster than they actually are. And the illusion becomes even more intense when we move the ribbings into the opposite direction of the progress. So it really cuts down perceived waiting time. That's also why you see this animation in the Gmail interface. And the same phenomena happens to moving objects. We perceive things that move linearly to be faster than east ones because we better get to observe the slower states of the east one. But time doesn't only change our perception, it also changes our expectations. When Blogger had their redesign, they had a problem because once people were finished with signing up to their service, there was a button that said create blog. So once you finally entered all your data, you could finally create your blog. And what happened, it created the blog instantly. And people felt like, this can't be right. That was too fast. That was too fast. Something must have gone wrong here. So what did they do? They introduced nothing but a page that shows a little spinner animation for a few seconds. And obviously, people suddenly loved it. They said, I'm really glad that Blogger does the heavy lifting here for me, and I don't have to take care of all this. So, all right, and then we have cushioning. Now, cushioning is another really important factor in motion design. Somehow, it always makes me think of my friend Lorian, who was worked with me at Information Architects. And he once said, out of all hand-throwable things, socks have the most unpredictable trajectory. Lorian Gradienok, creative technologist, very wise quote. And the more I thought about this, why would anyone tweet this, And then I did really start throwing socks around at home to try it out. And it turns out the reason it's so interesting is because it just relates to physics, right? It relates to things that happen in our natural environment. Now, unfortunately, computers couldn't care any less about gravity and physics. So without some fine-tuning, most animations look like this. They look robotic, boring, and most of all, unnatural. If we do just a little tuning, we can add some called easing, and we can spice up things a little. Now, the animations feels a lot more natural because things in the real world don't just suddenly stop, right? Doesn't happen. But there are some caveats when it comes to designing and using easing in animations, especially for things that enter and exit the frame. So if you're thinking about sidebars that enter in a mobile screen, always make sure that they enter at their peak performance, at their peak speed, because otherwise you feel like you have to unnecessarily wait for the user interface to appear, which is not delightful at all. So, and then we have state abstraction. Now, with flat UI and minimalism taking over, it's important to communicate states of an application in an understandable way. Let's take the mobile menu as an example. If you look at this mobile menu, as we see it all over the place, right? When we see it, the problem with this menu is that we don't see, is this currently active or is this currently not active? What happens when I click on it? Now, if we just change the icon on click, we can make sure that the user always knows what's going to happen next. This is a general problem that we have with toggle buttons. Is it the action that is currently active, or is it the action that's going to happen? And this tries to solve this problem. Or let's take the animation that I showed you at the very beginning, which starts as a simple button and then turns into a progress bar and then turns into a confirmation dialog. Everything happens at the same place, so the user's attention is already there, which is always great in interaction design because you don't have to guide the user anymore. So we can do all kinds of fancy things with it. There are these guys, don't remember, I think it's, flan.my, Marka, and you can go to their website and they have all these kinds of inspiration, how you can morph one button to another and what you can do to create smoother experiences. So state abstraction is about constantly communicating the state of a UI to the user. And then finally, we have personality. For any serious designer, self-actualization comes at the end of the design process. But with so many best practices in mobile design and also in web design, things start to look awfully similar, right? So this is something that is called branded interactions. Now, branded interactions have become a key component in mobile design because if everything looks the same, it's interactions that can make the key difference. Now, if you look at Facebook, for example, Facebook was the first to get these incredibly fluid animations. It's very responsive to the user's input, and they really took responsiveness in terms of UI and also the way animation fluidity to the next level. But we all know how it turned out. It failed quite miserably, right? And why did it fail? Because the tool was easy to use and the tool was beautiful to look at, but the people were not really sure what the essence of this tool actually is. What is the added value? There wasn't really any added value. So good interaction design won't save you there. And then we have Nike Make App, which is a really cool, handy app for people who want to create products for Nike. And they can browse different materials, and as you scroll it, you can see this animation here. It looks really cool, and it really suits the topic of the app, right? Materials. And also here, you can see another one from the same app. So it feels very natural. And at first I thought, well, that's maybe a little too much, but when you actually use the app, it doesn't really bug you as long as you take care that it doesn't distract you from finding content. It's a really, really nice way to showcase your content. And then we have Yahoo News Digest. And Yahoo News Digest had their app with this great parallax effect, or whatever you want to call it. And they were also very successful with this one. They came on Hacker News and got on the Next Web and all kinds of stuff. And that's also some pretty good marketing, right? And then we have these interactions and these animations that we just don't forget. I call them emotional interactions, because what happens here is when you go to readme.io and you want to enter your password, what happens is this. It's really cool. You're definitely gonna tell your friends about it, right? And then here's another one. Yacht Quest is an example I found on Dribbble that is really nice. So when content is loading here, you can see these beautiful animations here. You can see how the dots are animated on top. It's cropped a little, but look how nice this is done. This is incredible. Very nice, very nice. So personality is key in creating memorable experience, and the same applies to social interaction, right? No one will remember us if you're like everybody else. So now that we saw why animations matter and how we can create better animations, let's have a look at how we can communicate animations to our teams, because that's also something lots of people are struggling with. So the easiest way, and also the laziest way, but not such a bad way actually, is to refer to examples. you just simply go to websites that showcase animations. So for instance, Captivate.com is a great resource that shows interactions and animations for mobile devices, mostly iOS and Android. And you can just use these animations as an example. Hey, I want this to look like this. And that's totally okay. You can still fine-tune it later on. Or you go to Dribbble. If you go to Dribbble and search for UI animation, you're going to find some great examples. It's fantastic what they have. Or you can go to userinterfaces.io, which is a curated list from Instagram, and they have some great examples as well. You can go to useyourinterface.com, which is also pretty cool. They show you all the examples at once, and everything is animating at the same time. So if you're into this kind of shit, give it a try. And then we have Hover States. And Hover States is also pretty cool. It started as a project to just collect different hover states in user interfaces, but now they're also showcasing some other animations. Then we have Keynotes. Now, Keynotes is cool because everyone can use it, right? You don't have to be a UI animator or a professional. You can simply go into it, and if you click around long enough, basically everyone can get some decent looking animations. Now, this is an animation that a friend of mine, Jose Vitone, designed in Keynotes. I think it doesn't get any smoother than that. So for most cases, you can do a lot with Keynotes, but don't think of Keynote like the perfect animation tool that's really about sweating the details. Think of it more like Balsamiq for animations. So just laying out the rough guideline how an animation should work, and then you can still refine it later on in the development phase. And then we have After Effects. Now if you want to go crazy, use After Effects, because After Effects basically allows you to do everything. There's just one single problem with After Effects, and that's it has a user interface from hell. Because when you look at it, there's so much UI in it that it's completely overwhelming. Am I about? Yeah, okay. It's completely overwhelming. It takes some time to get around this user interface, but once you've figured it out, it's really very strong tool. As a matter of fact, I created these animations with After Effects as well, and I've now integrated it into my workflow. But if I had to go back, I would probably give Keynote a better chance, because I think it's really easy to do some quick sketching there. And then we have Framer. Now, Framer is a tool that basically allows you to write code and animate at the same time. It uses JavaScript as its language. It's an abstraction of JavaScript that has some easier syntax for you to create that is more effective for creating animated interfaces. And what you can do is pretty impressive. For instance, they have this collection. If you go to framer.com, you can see a lot of examples there that you can download right away and use as a template, and then you can build upon this and learn how this is done. And this is an example, for instance, from framer.com that shows the iconic pull to refresh animation in a Google app. And you can do some pretty cool stuff with it. And there's now Framer Studio available for download, so you guys should definitely check it out. And then we have InVision. Now, fortunately, someone introduced this already, and as I'm running out of time, I'm really glad about this. Now, InVision is really cool because it allows you, if you're already working with Sketch, it's really amazing because it syncs with Dropbox and you can automatically sync your Sketch files over to InVision. In short, what InVision, if I had to describe in one sentence what InVision does, I would just show you this animated GIF here, where you can add click targets and you can basically link different information spaces together with animations or without animations the way you want. So it's really easy to quickly iterate and build prototypes. And then use understandable vocabulary. Did you ever see someone talking about animations? Mostly when they do it, they say things like, view, I want this to view. Or if you imagine you had to describe the Genie effect on Mac OS X, you would say, I want it to, you know. It's horrible. You don't want to be that guy, seriously. So what you can do instead, you go to easings.net, and there you have a collection of different animation curves. There are different animation curves, and once you hover with your mouse over the animation curves, you can see how it feels. And those are called developer-friendly animation curves because you can simply refer these different curves to any developer and you can just straight away implement them into different tools. Sorry? Easings.net. Easings.net. Yeah, it's cut off. Sorry. So, to sum this up, carefully crafted interaction designs can change the way we use websites. And I loved Frank Chimero's quote there. Frank Chimero once said that people ignore design that ignores people. And no worries. Animations make digital experiences more memorable, and if we take care of these details that are in fact not just details, we can create better experiences. And yeah, I pretty much leave you with these words. Go out and build awesome stuff. Thank you.